Oh, hey. Oh, hello. Oh, hi.
Hey,
Hey. How you doing, girl?
I'm happy to be here right
Good.
now, and that's all I will say to that.
Listen, it's a complicated question and answer, and I get it. Welcome to Vanguard STEM, y'all. Welcome to On the Vanguard. My name is Dr. Jedidah Isler.
And my name is Anicca Harriot, soon to be doctor.
That's right, proto doctor happening, forming in front of our face. And we are so excited to have you here for our, what month is this? April edition of On the Vanguard, where we're talking about Black and Green. Anicca is dressed in theme. The fact that environmental justice is racial justice. We are so excited to have an amazing lineup for you today. It is a pleasure and an honor, and I may in fact get verklempt about who's in the room and what they're going to say. But before that, like I said, my name is Jedidah. I am an astrophysicist by training. I care a lot about STEM equity policy. I care a lot about science communication, and kicking it with really, really, really fly folks, particularly Black women, Indigenous women, people of color. So you can subscribe to us on YouTube. I know it's pointing down. I get it. And you can read all of our new content on our site, conversations.vanguardstem.com, including our brand new piece about environmental justice, which our very own Anicca Harriot wrote. So I will pass the mic to you.
Well, once again, my name is Anicca Harriot. I am a PhD candidate studying biochemistry and molecular biology, specifically muscle biology and how your muscles change with aging and also in space. I also have interest in STEM equity and policy. That's why Jedidah and I get along so well, one of many reasons. I also would like to shout out Geraldine Ezeka, who is a PhD candidate right there with me, who is our social media coordinator, and she will be reading all of your comments in all of the places tonight if you're tweeting us your questions or insights at Vanguard STEM. Also, Dr. Kayla Miles will be down in those comments, hopefully hyping us because she's amazing. And we are so excited to have our team out there interacting with you as we share in conversation with our guests here. So be sure to tweet us at Vanguard STEM or comment below if you would like to engage with us live right now during this conversation. And with that being said, I think that we should go over some of those rules for our engagement. So Vanguard STEM is a movement, an online platform, a community, a hyperspace that is built and curated by Black women, for women of color, non-binary people of color in STEM. And we just ask that you respect this brave space that we have curated and coordinated for you tonight and all the other times too. So we are asking that as you comment and tweet at us, that you remember not to engage in any isms, no racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, any kinds of bias. If it's got an ism or a phobia, we don't want it here. And we will ask you to leave. We will use that block button if we have to. And I think that I will leave it to your discretion there. We're all capable folks out here. So that's all I'll say there.
Thank you so much. And so what are we doing today? We are talking Black and Green, environmental justice as racial justice. And like I said, if you ever forget, just check out Anicca's shirt. It's Black, it's green, it's telling you what we all about. So the goal of the show is to highlight Black women experts in environmental justice and share wisdom. It is my distinct honor and pleasure, I legit am fangirling as I say it, to introduce to you Dr. Ayanna Johnson, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's going to give us the real about environmental justice and how it is identically racial justice, and particularly how coastal communities of color are disparately impacted by decades of environmental racism and now bear the brunt of the climate crisis. We're going to talk about greenwashing and how future tech is supposed to save us, and yet it's causing problems and being a menace to the environment in and of itself. And critically, we're going to talk about concrete steps that our audience can take to use their STEM expertise to address how much of this climate and environmental justice issue is racial justice. So without further ado, let me introduce you to marine biologist, policy expert, writer, thought leader, founder, Brooklyn native, and the homie, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who's the founder of Urban Ocean Lab. She's the co-founder of the All We Can Save project. Cannot wait to talk about that. And all around boss. Thank you for coming.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Oh my goodness, sis. Like, just can we take a moment to just observe your greatness here? We're just so excited to have you. Like,
You're so ridiculous.
I am, and I love you, and it's now on tape. So
Tell the world.
Let's just dive right in. Dr. Johnson, Ayanna, tell us,
Yes.
for those who
Dr.
may not
Isler.
know, what is environmental racism?
Ooh. Environmental racism is people of color having to deal with worse environmental conditions. Drinking water, air quality, the impacts of climate change, hurricanes, all that stuff. Lack of access to like healthy, intact nature. In cities, we think about it as like, who gets trees and parks, you know? I think about that a lot. It's all of those things, like who gets to experience the good versions of the environment and who gets stuck with the sort of horrific, messed up parts of the environment and the things that humanity has done to it.
It's so like I appreciate that framing. And, you know, both of us come from slightly different fields, right? I'm in astrophysics, Anicca's in biochemistry, molecular biophysics. I always say it wrong. She'll forgive me. But, you know, we often are trying to convince our colleagues that racism is innately structural and that there's like, it's not just the like bad things people say to one another. It's literally embedded in the systems. And it feels like what you're saying is that environmental racism is literally the physical manifestation of structural racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we think about it in terms of like redlining, which is structural racism, which determines like where Black people and people of color got to buy houses, get to live, build communities. There is actually strong alignment. There was a report that just came out earlier this week that is very much aligned with flood zones, which is, you know, an environmental risk and a risk that is increasing in many places due to sea level rise, which is an impact of climate change. So that's something I think about a lot. Like, where was public housing built in New York City? In flood zones. Who was screwed by Hurricane Sandy? People in public housing in flood zones, and people who had the least resources with which to rebuild. And so it just sort of like the climate crisis, all these extreme weather events that are fueled by it tend to just like exacerbate the existing inequalities created by structural racism.
And so then would we think about, I guess I have two thoughts. One is, you know, you talk about how part of the reason you do this work is so that you feel like you're doing something. And then there's also the sort of scope and scale of what needs to happen on so many different levels. And so when we think about which is environmental racism, and then we think about what we'd like to see, which is environmental justice, how do you start to make inroads along that direction?
So the way that I am developing my contributions to that solution right now is to think about like, how can I be part of supporting women of color leading on climate? Because we know that women of color in all these communities have been working on environmental issues for as long as they've existed, right? Like, we've been caring about our drinking water. We've been caring about our air quality. Like, no one wanted to live next to an oil refinery and have to breathe in all that stuff and be at higher risk for respiratory diseases, asthma, cancer, et cetera. So I think uplifting the work that's been done, making sure people know that we have so many leaders of color in environmental work already, making sure that we can help direct more resources to their work, because obviously people are just like MacGyvering this stuff, right? Just like,
Right.
I don't know, I don't have anything, like this is not even my full-time job, but like my side hustle is to get clean water for my community. And I'm just gonna like keep going until I figure it out. And so like, it shouldn't be that hard.
Right.
And so figuring out how to make it not be that hard. And so the anthology, All We Can Save, was one iteration of that. Our nonprofit, the All We Can Save project, is really figuring out what it looks like to support women of color in particular over the long term, who are doing the most transformative work. Because I mean, can you imagine if women of color, if like Black women doing important climate work actually had all the resources that we needed?
Yeah.
Like that would be a very useful step in the right direction if we could just like had what we needed to do the work. And so that's what I think about a lot. And as you know, like a lot of my work right now is on like the narrative shift piece of that. Like people don't know that people of color care more about climate. We just assume this myth that we've been told is like white people care more. They're the ones doing the work. They're the ones who get it. They're the ones who care. But like polling from Yale and George Mason universities shows that only 49% of white Americans are concerned about climate, whereas 57% of Black Americans, 69% of Latinx Americans are concerned. So we need to flip the myth, like correct the mythology that white people care more. And we need to think about how to do work that deliberately welcomes in people of color, because why shouldn't we just be working with the people who already care the most and get it if we want to solve this problem?
Right.
Yeah.
Lord.
I feel like we've already kind of given a preface to every topic that we'll want to dive into on the show tonight. So before we really roll our sleeves up and get into the nitty gritty, I would just like for you to share with your audience a little bit of your origin story. How did you get involved with this work?
Yeah, I think like most people who have chosen these weird science careers, it's some sort of childhood wonder or awe, just like, tell me more about how the world works. And for me, that was seeing a coral reef for the first time when I was a little girl, and went on a glass bottom boat in the Florida Keys and was just like, excuse me, there are fish with very, very bright colors hanging out under the surface here. And like, tell me more about this whole thing. And I had fish tanks in my house growing up, and like loved going to the aquarium. And so that was just to me like, cool, I'm in. Like sign me up. And so many kids who have a positive experience with the ocean want to become marine biologists. It's a pretty common dream job for like a 5-year-old. And part of the answer is just that I'm stubborn and was like, no, really, I'm going to do this. Part of the answer is that my parents were like, sure, that seems reasonable. You can do that, which is not every parent says that. And part of it is that I realized it wasn't just about science, that ocean conservation was very different from just like ocean science, because it requires policy, it requires economics, it requires sociology, it requires like understanding the cultural context, right? And so my work for the 10 years that I was focused on ocean conservation was really looking at it like that puzzle, and then trying to figure out like, what weird shapes are even these pieces, and like how the heck can we put them together?
There's so much about what you said. I agree with Anicca. There's just so many pieces that I want to pull on, like, you know, from the wonderment, right? Like you're right. If you ask a lot of Black women of color, non-binary folks of color who are scientists now, what got them into it,
it's just cool.
Don't say, right. Like,
have you ever heard of an octopus? Have you seen an octopus? Try not to be intrigued by an octopus. I dare you, right?
That what didn't the octopus documentary just win the Oscar?
Yeah.
Which was
apparently there's some critiques of that.
Oh, okay, then I won't say anything else about
which
that.
I mean, I watched it with my mom and was like, oh, that's a nice story. But in terms of like centering a white man's emotions as the way into conservation or caring. It sort of just like repeats the narrative. And yeah, they're, you know, but you know, there's always people make careers off critique. So I don't want to like play into that too much. And we hear the same thing when people do documentaries about agriculture and farming. It's like, well, they didn't talk about this. And I'm like, well, you know, it's only one movie. Like make another movie about the other elements of it. So my mom loved it. She thought it was the perfect movie.
No.
I thought there were moments when it got a little creepy. Like I was like, are you going to make out with the octopus? Like really intimate.
Some moments that were very intimate and I wasn't quite.
I was like, where is this film going?
It's so true. I can't lie.
But I think the other piece of my story there is like, yes, I wanted to be a marine biologist, you know, when I was 5, but when I was 10 and was learning about the civil rights movement and watching Eyes on the Prize, which I was not old enough to handle, I was like, oh, I want to be the lawyer that gets the next Martin Luther King out of jail. Like super, super specific dream job. It was like, you don't get murdered, you're super useful, and like, you can just like do a bunch of nerdy book stuff, you know, great. And then I started like backpacking and wanted to be a park ranger because like you could get paid to walk through the forest every day. And then I wanted to be an environmental lawyer once I realized like there were bad guys and you could fight them with the legal system. And then I ended up like in policy after college, working for the Environmental Protection Agency, and decided I needed to go to graduate school and looked for specifically an interdisciplinary program because all those things I described, right? Like the marine biologist, the like civil rights, the law, justice piece, the park ranger piece, the like protected areas piece, and thinking about like policy. It's all of those things together. And so as a conversation about STEM, I will say, perhaps the most notable thing about my PhD dissertation is that each chapter was published in a completely different genre of journal, right? There was like an ecology one, there was like one that was published in a fisheries journal, there was one that was published in like a behavioral economics, an environmental economics journal, there was a policy one, because to me, it's always been about like this puzzle. And so sometimes I'm embarrassed to talk with people who have the depth of scientific subject matter expertise as both of you do, because I didn't cultivate that. Like, I don't know the names of all the fish. I don't understand everything about oceanography. And so I sometimes feel like a fraud when I like introduce myself as a marine biologist as like the first thing I say, because like I earned the degree, like, don't get me wrong, like I deserved that PhD, but I don't do scientific research now. I never intended to be an academic. I just wanted to like know enough science to be useful and to interpret it for policy.
But I think that's what it's supposed to be, right? I think, going to the point that, we aren't all intended to do a deep dive into one thing, no pun intended, and that ultimately that's not necessarily the right thing to do. First of all, I don't know the names of all the stars. I don't know the names of any stars. I can't point any constellations out to you. So I hope that makes you feel better.
It does, actually.
Like I'm legit serious. If you said, where is Cassiopeia? I'd be like, in the sky.
No, so I know that one. Come on.
I do not. But the point that first of all, just statistically speaking, right? Like women of color, Black women in particular, are more likely to want to do things that actually impact and improve the world in the first place. So the fact that you've constructed a STEM identity and a reality that allows you to actually do the thing that changes the world makes sense and is consistent with, what's happening. And when you said your dissertation was a different chapter, I was like, man, I wish I could have done that, because then I'd have more, breadth in all these other ways. So I think, it takes all kinds. And I think we're finding our ways around to doing the kind of collaborative work that you do, which is to pull in people that have different pieces that they can add to the puzzle to make it better. So truly, I'm glad that your story is the way that it is, and that you are so successful, because it validates for other people that this is a way to be successful and to be impactful. So I was not joking with the fangirl thing at the beginning. We're doing a great job.
I think it's like, to me, science is a tool. It's a really valuable tool for understanding the world, for designing solutions, for designing policy that's actually informed by data, right? So it's really important to understand the quantitative piece of like, how do we create ocean conservation that would be effective? How do we design marine protected areas? How do we start to think about, developing an offshore wind energy industry in the United States, right? There's a science piece to that. There's a policy piece to that. There's economics. And there's just like, a lot of it is like something that doesn't get talked about enough. A lot of it is culture. And so, yeah, that's where my work sort of is sitting now, which I'm a bit uncomfortable with. So I'm actually thinking, when you invited me to do this, I was like, I'm kind of saying no to everything right now, but of course I have to say yes to Vanguard STEM, because Black science nerds every day, all day. But I think there's this balance, right, between talking and doing. And sounds like I'm diminishing the talking, because it really is important to obviously explain ideas and to like bring people along in the work. But for me, as someone who never intended to be like a public communicator as my job, I feel like the pendulum has swung too far. Like I need to write more policy memos, and I need to create the next iteration of like work and like a mentoring program within All We Can Save project and the curriculum development piece. Like I need to do more of the like Google Docs, collaborating, like creating new things and then talk about them, as opposed to just like talking about myself or the stuff I've done in the past. It's like, I'm ready for the next wave.
Yeah, I mean, while we're admitting the things that we don't know in our fields,
Ooh, bring it on. Make me feel
please do not ask me Krebs cycle. I learn it every year and it goes in one end, out the other. Please. But I really think, that being said, that what I'm hearing from you is something that we just value so much in Vanguard STEM, and that we wrote about in our first peer-reviewed publication, that we like to call the Intersectional Scientific Method, which is this scientific method broken down into how your identity influences the way that you practice science. And so rather than coming from this unbiased, which usually means straight, white, male kind of approach to science, you bring in your situated knowledges and your biases. So like the fact that you want to help your community, that is a bias. Why would you want to remove that from the way that you practice science? And then how those biases, those situated knowledges, the experiences that you have as an individual then impact the questions that you choose to ask and the science that you choose to pursue. So I just really wanted to like emphasize and reflect that back, and especially for our audience members who are definitely identifying with that particular comment. I think that really more than anything, what that ability to have your dissertation chapters published in so many different journals, which I definitely took a note on that one as I'm writing. But I think that what that really shows is agency, right? And that's something that we are not often empowered to express and take advantage of through our pursuit of science.
Yeah, I mean, I had like the best possible setup when I was entering graduate school. I had 2 fellowships. I had the NSF graduate fellowship, and I had an IGERT fellowship, the interdisciplinary graduate research education training thing. So I was funded to do interdisciplinary work. I was working within a center that supported that at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation. So I had 5 years of funding before I started, which meant I could study whatever I wanted, right? Like I could follow my nose in a way that a lot of grad students aren't able to, because you're working under a professor's grant or you're a TA or a research assistant or something like that. And I was just like, there's pros and cons to being completely on your own, right? But I was just like very much on my own. And, you know, the types of integrating social science that deeply into a marine biology degree was something not a lot of people, at least at my school, were doing. And so I was very much charting my own path, but also like reinventing a lot of wheels. Like obviously people have done social survey design method before, and I like reinvented the entire thing. So yeah, I think what you were saying about biases is really interesting to me, because we have such a negative association with that term. Of course I have a bias to like Black people not getting killed in hurricanes. And so I don't know that if it, I feel like it's, I feel like we almost need another word for that, like priorities and insights, right? Like I'm the daughter of a Jamaican immigrant who grew up fishing, and the ocean was is a big part of Jamaican culture. And so of course I have a bias towards preserving Caribbean cultures, which requires preserving the ocean. And that's, you know, that was a big part of what motivated my early research, was like, how can we have a fish fry in the future? How can grandparents take their grandkids fishing in the future? Like we need to have fish in order to have those things happen.
Right, because frying just oil is not actually it. It's not it. It's interesting that you say that. So, you know, agree that biases is probably not the right word, but I appreciate that lens, Anicca, for, you know, thinking about the fact that there is some sense of priority, to your point, Ayanna. And the other, you know, one of the terms that we found in the literature was basically called situated knowledge, right? That it is that sense of like, you know from somewhere, and that knowledge itself informs what you do. And to the methodology that Anicca was talking about that we were trying to develop in our paper, so we called things that include situated knowledge embedded context. So it's all of that stuff. It's the sitting on the beach doing the fish fry.
I can't wait to read this paper.
Oh, we'll send you the link.
Put the link in the chat. Let's go.
We will do it in right now. And actually, maybe this is a good time to pivot to the point you made earlier about like wanting to do the work and not necessarily just talk about it. Because, you know, that's for us the same thing. Like we want to we want to have these conversations so that we can talk about the intersectional scientific methodology. And it sounds like you want to have conversations about protecting coastal climates because you want folks that are living on the coast to thrive and be safe, because they also care about climate change. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about feminist climate resistance and your feminist climate renaissance, and what you see as the future of that going forward.
So that term, feminist climate renaissance, is like, I was with Catherine, who's the co-editor of this anthology, All We Can Save, and we had to write a grant proposal for hosting a retreat of women climate leaders. And we had to like name the event. It was at a ranch in Montana. And so I was just like, I just wrote in the form, I was like, feminist climate renaissance. Like that is what we are creating with this event. That's what we will call it. And for me, that really stuck, because feminist, like in my definition, is really about ensuring gender equality. And so in the same way that having like eliminating racism from the way that we approach climate work is critical, right? If we're going to have all hands on deck, if we're going to do this transformation from a fossil fuel economy to a regenerative economy and like make sure everyone gets to come, and is like, there's a good future for all of us. We need, in the same way that we need racial diversity as a part of who's crafting the solutions, we need gender as a part of that too. Because obviously like leaving the brain power of like half the people on the planet is just like, you're gonna lose. So I wanna win at addressing the climate crisis. And honestly, like that's what it comes down to. Like, what does success require? It requires all the best ideas from wherever they are found, and resourcing people, no matter what they look like, who can make them happen. And I guess, so the word feminist is really thinking about the quantitative data that shows that when women have an equal seat at the table, we actually have better outcomes for the environment. So when we have women who have more seats in parliament, those parliaments pass stronger environmental laws, they enforce them more strongly, they create more protected areas. Women were the lead negotiators for the only like real global climate treaty that we have, right? The Paris Agreement. And so when we think about like, it's just sort of like an imperative to make sure that the decision-making tables include women. And the word renaissance, feminist climate renaissance, is that I think we need to shift from a focus on like we need to fight climate change, we need to defeat climate change, all these like war metaphors. It's like we're not battling the atmosphere, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I definitely want to like throw down against fossil fuel companies, but like, let's be clear on like who the enemy is. It's not the air. And that what we need is a rebirth instead of to win a war. We need like this transformation of our culture. And so to think of feminist climate renaissance as, what if we had a climate movement with gender equality that was really about cultural transformation and rebirth of the way that we live together and on this planet? Like, that's what I want. I don't want to just like fight against the past. I want to build the future.
Yeah, I think in writing the little preface article that we shared with our audience for this conversation, that was really a point that I came across often. But it's also something that we've said before in Vanguard STEM. I think that it's even included in our like sizzle reel, which is, what would it look like if the people who truly are the enemies or the ones that we're fighting against just got out of the way and let the folks who already know what the solutions that we need
Girl,
are.
that's like 90% of the solution.
Yes. And I mean, you've already said it. I think you said it in the first 10 minutes. And so one of the questions that I really wanted to ask is, what are some of those things that are working? What are some of the organizations that, or communities that you've worked with that you would say that we should really support more, things that maybe you're even proud of having worked with?
So I'm just going to close my window so you don't have to hear too much of the Brooklyn shenanigans. Hold on one sec.
I love it.
Yes, as someone who is in downtown Baltimore, I definitely understand that sentiment. So I'm very glad that, knock on wood, the sirens and helicopters and whatnot have held out for us tonight. So
Moose are very quiet, so we don't have any problems here.
So now that it's summer, the ice cream truck just starts circling my block every day from like 2 to 5. And everyone on Zoom is like, "You gonna go get some ice cream?" So this is the book, All We Can Save, and on the back, it's the best part, it's a list of all the contributors. Instead of like endorsements from famous white men climate people, we were like, no, we want to like double down on highlighting the chorus of voices within the book. And when you ask this question, I immediately go to the work of some of these women, like Colette Pichon-Battle, who is an attorney from the Bayou in Louisiana, and founded and leads the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, that's been just doing incredible work with Gulf South for a Green New Deal, and she's now leading the climate work that the Movement for Black Lives is doing. What does a red, black, and green New Deal look like? How do we make sure that all of this federal attention now on climate policy and investing in historically disadvantaged communities actually tangibly helps Black folks? And so I'm just really inspired by her work, and I'm dragging her into doing some ocean stuff because we talk a lot about environmental justice and climate justice, but almost always we leave the ocean and coast out of that conversation. So that's a lot of what I do, is just be like, also the ocean in like every climate meeting I'm in. So her work comes to mind. Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, who leads Uprose out of Brooklyn, and really focused on like the sort of like Latin Caribbean and New York in how we think about climate, and how we make sure that, like, if we're going to put up wind turbine farms off the coast, like who gets those jobs? Like in what communities is like the manufacturing and whatever happening, right? So those are the first two that come to mind. Reading about their work has been really wonderful to me. And Christine Nieves Rodriguez in Puerto Rico, who just like completely reshaped her community after Hurricane Maria, was like, oh, we need to be able to fend for ourselves, is what we learned from this. The government is not coming to save us. What does it mean to have resilience in the context of extreme weather events fueled by climate change? Yeah, so the list goes on, but those are the first three people who come to mind.
You know, it's one of those things where, like, I'm so glad we're having this conversation, and I think that there's definitely stuff that we need to have shared Google Docs and collaborate on too, because there's just so much overlap in the ways that we think and process this information. Because, you know, half the work that we do in VS is to be like, we don't need to attract people into this work. We don't need to like convince them that this is interesting and exciting, particularly Black people, particularly Black women, particularly non-binary folks of color and STEM. We all already think it's cool, right? Like what we need.
Why would you not like science?
Legit. Like we just need y'all to get out of the way so we can do our job, right? And so, you know, there's that point. And then the other point that you just said, which I just want to like completely underscore, is that there are already, and I appreciate Anicca the question, there are already people doing the work. There are always some of us doing the work. It's just whether or not we have all the resource we need. But can we go back to that point really quickly that you made about how you sort of raise your hand in meetings and say also the ocean? Because it's true, I didn't start thinking about ocean conservation as a thing until I met you. And so could you talk about, like, I know you did marine biology, but like, could you talk about how it became, not necessarily from a historical perspective, but how you came to think about wind turbines off the coast and all of those kinds of things as ways to contribute to the conversation?
So maybe the most concrete recent example is the Green New Deal. So for people who haven't read it, which is probably most of the people watching it, I will say it's 14 pages, double spaced, pretty large font. The first page is just basically a list of co-sponsors and a summary of some of the science. So it will take you 5 or 10 minutes to read it. And then we can have like a real conversation of like, do we like it? I like it, except for this part. Like, this seems like maybe it wouldn't be that effective, but it's a vision statement for what federal ocean policy, a framework for federal ocean policy, and what should be included in that. And how would we actually address the climate crisis in ways that take care of all Americans, which includes things like universal healthcare. Because if your healthcare is tied to your job and you need to go like work on solar something in the Midwest, and you can't go because you've got like an illness, which in the United States we call pre-existing conditions, which is just like being a human, then it's a mess, and we can't have the shifts we need in terms of people filling all these like very different and new jobs that are going to become available. So like it or hate it, I hope people like are making an informed decision, not just listening to some pundit with some one-liner and then assuming that that's the right thing. All that said, when I read it, I was like, where's the ocean? Got to page 10 and I was like, things we should protect include blah, blah, blah of the ocean. I was like, that's all we get, like that's not going to cut it, because offshore renewable energy is a really big opportunity. Offshore wind, floating solar panels are apparently a thing, like wave and tidal energy is a thing. Like, what's the plan for that? What's the plan for ports that are going to need to be a big part of that? What's the plan for farming in the ocean? They have farming on land included in there, but what about regenerative farming in the ocean that's absorbing all of this carbon dioxide and producing really low carbon footprint foods? I'm sure the Krebs cycle is involved in some way in all of that. And thinking about how coastal ecosystems protect us from extreme weather events, from storms, right? If we think about New York City and Hurricane Sandy, the 15% of historic wetlands that were remaining prevented over $600 million in damage. That's really a big deal. And it's the same in New Orleans. All the wetlands there that have been eroded because of channelizing the Mississippi River and all the development and all of that stuff has meant that like there's less natural protection when the next storm comes. So I think about those things when I think about ocean and climate. I think about the ocean as a source of solutions to absorb carbon, to protect us from storms, to provide us with clean energy. I didn't see that in there. So I was like, all right, y'all, who's gonna tell them? And I was talking to some colleagues who, of course, like every ocean person was thinking the same thing, and got together with two of them and wrote an op-ed called The Big Blue Gap in the Green New Deal, which got some attention, got the attention of a think tank. We then collaborated with this think tank to do some polling around Americans supporting things like offshore renewable energy, et cetera. Turns out people thought it was a great idea. And we did some analysis around the job and economic opportunities and benefits from including the ocean in our climate policy. And then one of my colleagues asked a question in the CNN Climate Town Hall about this to Elizabeth Warren, and she was like, yeah, seems like a Blue New Deal would be a good idea. Then her campaign called me and was like, my boss agreed on national television to a Blue New Deal, like, can you help us? And so next thing you know, I'm like advising the Warren campaign on ocean policy. And since no other primary candidate was releasing ocean policy plans, like it was the one. And so when Biden became the nominee, some of those ideas got incorporated into his climate plan. And now some of the people who worked on that are in the White House. And we have a marine biologist who, working in CEQ, and we have all of these folks who get it now making policy. And for me, that's like the best example I'll probably ever have in my entire life of what it means to raise your hand for the ocean, because it's not that AOC hates the ocean. It's that wasn't what she was thinking about. And Senator Ed Markey, who introduced it in the Senate, and their colleagues, it's just not their frame of reference. And so it's not a competing proposal, it's like a supplementary piece. And to me, it's all about making sure the ideas carry forward, sort of like no matter which politicians are in power. I know some people really don't like Elizabeth Warren. I don't care. These are still good policy ideas. Like, how are we going to transform our ports? How are we going to manage fishing when the fish are migrating towards the poles in search of cooler water because we're heating everything up, right? Like the questions and needs remain. And so that's been a big lesson learned for me, is like, just focus on carrying the ideas forward and worry less about like individuals and think more about like the structures and the processes and making people care at all.
I just need to jump and say one thing. First of all, I stand. Second, like, I think the whole, like, I love that you want time to go and do the thing, but it sounds like the thing you did in speaking out was the thing that you needed to do at that moment. So like, I'm not sure that I can now co-sign your earlier comment, because what you just told me was you raised your hand and said something in public, and now here we have policy implications.
There's pieces of it, right? And I think one of the projects I'm working on next with Urban Ocean Lab, which is this policy think tank I co-founded for the future of coastal cities, is what does a Blue New Deal look like at the city level? And so that's what that's what our team is working on right now, because cities can be so much more nimble, right, than the entire federal government. And cities can be like laboratories for what works that can then inform state and federal policy. So I'm kind of like going back and saying like, okay, like if we're taking if we're looking at this at a different geographic scale, what does that template need to include? But yeah, that balance between like doing something and then talking about the thing, and then doing another thing and then talking about the thing, instead of just like.
So we had a question from our YouTube audience, and I think that you've really done a great job of already covering this, but just to summarize from this last segment that we've been discussing, this question is, what kind of upcoming or current environmental government policies should folks be aware of and supporting or following? So you've mentioned the Green New Deal, 14 pages. We can all go and digest that. And then also the big blue gap in the Green New Deal. Are there other policies that, just as a summary of this last segment of our discussion, that you could mention?
So the environmental and climate justice community worked really hard to push the Biden campaign to include some big commitments to environmental justice in his campaign promises, and now in executive orders and federal agency policy, and in what's being introduced into Congress. And one of the elements there is this commitment to 40% of the resources or benefits that are dedicated to addressing the climate crisis would go to benefiting communities of color, historically disadvantaged communities. And so great that there's this commitment. 40% is actually like a very big number. Like, I was surprised by that. I think it's appropriate, but if not more, right? But I think to see that number and see that commitment, and I think they like really do want to make this happen. But the question is like, how do we define disadvantaged communities? How do we define benefit to them? How do we ensure communities have agency in getting like the benefits they actually need, instead of just like getting handed a bunch of stuff that they don't need? And so I think it's one of, like all of these big promises, the details really matter. So that's one thing I would say folks might want to keep an eye on. There's also a campaign promise that turned into an executive order commitment around this idea of 30 by 30, protecting 30% of nature by 2030, of our lands and waters. But like, which places? And will communities of color have access to them easily? And like, all of that kind of stuff. Will they be representative of, all the suite of ecosystems and like priority ecologies, or just like politically expedient locations, right? And like, there's going to be a lot of nitty gritty around where those boundaries get drawn. And of course, making sure Indigenous tribes have a very strong role to say in making those determinations will be critical. And the last one that I'm sort of really excited about and keeping my eye on is this concept of a civilian climate corps, like putting people back to work post-pandemic, especially post-recession, created by mismanagement of the pandemic by the last administration, to be more specific. Like, what does it mean to create jobs that actually help address the climate crisis? And the Civilian Climate Corps is really focused on how do we protect and restore nature as jobs. There are like many millions of dollars of shovel-ready projects along those lines, right, across the country. And so making sure that program gets properly resourced through congressional appropriations, run through the Department of Interior. I'm just really excited to see what that might look like, because it's taking the model of the New Deal and these large government employment programs and directing that towards climate solutions. So I think it's really cool. It was a campaign proposal from Governor Jay Inslee's campaign, which was focused exclusively on climate, and it's something that was carried forward through the Biden campaign and now the administration. So we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for all of the insight that you've shared with us and with our audience tonight. Can you just let us know where folks can connect with you, follow all of the things that you're doing? I know there's a podcast and lots of other things you're working on.
So all of it is at ayannaelizabeth.com. You'll find all my projects, all my publications, my peer-reviewed scientific articles, as well as like op-eds and blog posts. I am at Ayanna Eliza on Twitter and Instagram. And the podcast is called How to Save a Planet. And in last week's episode is called Where's My Climate Anthem? And it's about why we don't have an anthem for the climate movement and how we need one, and uses the civil rights movement as an analog, right? How important music was to that work. And I like both sing and rap in that episode. So I don't know if that's enticing or like repellent, but there's that. I really love that podcast. So How to Save a Planet, available on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And the All We Can Save project, which is at All We Can Save on Twitter and Instagram. And this book exists. And the paperback is coming out this summer. And I guess I'll just leave you with the subtitle, which is Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. Like that's the trifecta. I'm like, hope, yeah, if you want to talk about hope, fine. But like, I want to talk about truth, courage, and solutions. Because to me, that's about like, who's doing what, like how fast can we get there? Like, let's go.
I will definitely be checking out that episode of the podcast. Jedidah can tell you I absolutely did send a black and green playlist to the Slack before we started this episode. So that's right up my alley.
In on that.
Yeah. Well, you know, we don't have a climate anthem, so I had to do my best there. But thank you again so much. It was wonderful to be in conversation with you, sharing your expertise and your situated knowledges.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you. And we'll send you a link to our paper. We'll connect offline. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Bye.
Bye. All right, fam. So we're moving into the last segment of our show. It is the Ed. This month we're featuring Dr. Beronda Montgomery, who we're super excited about. I'm going to have Anicca introduce her in just a second, but what I just needed to say that we are all the way here for Black women writing, for women of color writing, for non-binary folks of color writing. And so we're featuring Beronda Montgomery this month. You saw Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson has a book, so you know we're going to have to find a way to have that on our list too, but that's coming. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Anicca.
All right, so I am thrilled to be reintroducing Dr. Beronda Montgomery, who is a writer, researcher, and scholar pursuing the common theme of understanding how individuals perceive, respond to, and are impacted by the environments in which they exist. So her primary laboratory research is focused on the responses of photosynthetic organisms, that's plants and cyanobacteria for all you folks out there, how they respond to light and nutrient cues. But Dr. Beronda Montgomery also pursues this same theme in the context of effective mentoring. So how are individuals impacted by their environments in order to produce wonderful leaders and innovative academics. So we are so excited to be in conversation with Dr. Beronda Montgomery. Once again, if you didn't tune in to our January episode, you can watch that after this, where Dr. Beronda Montgomery shared all of her mentoring insights with us. And you can also read her Women Crush Wednesday and STEM feature on conversations.vanguardstem.com. And if you would like to win a copy of this book, and you have not already, you can tweet us at Vanguard STEM to ask a question for this next segment, or comment your questions in the YouTube comments below. And that's open to all US residents. I think I got everything.
Hello. I am so happy to be back. I'm always happy to be here with the Vanguard family.
Okay, so listen, we got to get right into it. Tell us everything. What made you write this book? Where did you get the idea? What do you want people to pull from it? Tell us everything about your book.
Yeah, so lessons from plants originally came from me wanting to connect with my family who was not scientists and wanting to invite them into my obsession with science and plants. So I started to share lessons with plants with them. And then it took root out of desperation to have the conversations I needed to have about tough issues, community, cultural change, equity. And often when we start those conversations, people shut down from defensiveness. So I lured them in with the beautiful stories of plants before I had to tell them that they were the one killing the plants and we need to have a conversation about that. So it started there.
So how does this book relate to your other, I'll say, prolific bodies of work?
You know, it is this book encompasses everything that I do, from the work we do in the lab with plants and other organisms, from the work that I've talked about with mentoring, from a lot of my more recent work with leadership. It really brings it all together and it is the representation. I've said to people all the time that all the work that I do is a single body of work. And I think this book really shows how in my mind that is true, how all of those things come together in our being in the world.
Actually, can I just jump in on that? I know we are doing a number of different things, but like the idea of figuring out all the different facets that one needs to actually truly build a body of work. You know, in our earlier episode, we were talking to Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and she was talking about how each part of her dissertation was in a different journal. And I think looking at your website and seeing the different tabs and then hearing you say it's all part of a body of work, it's a recurring theme that I think is liberating, at least for me, to know that like you really do need to pull from different parameter spaces to get a full picture.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the things that was transformative for me was when I realized early in my career, I knew that's what I was doing, but being able to communicate that to others, because people will see that you're doing work in all different areas. And I heard, you know, Ayanna's talking about how maybe I'm doing things in all these areas, but there's a single question I'm asking the world, and that's how do all of us, plants, humans, cyanobacteria, know who we are, where we are, and what we should be doing, and how do we exist in community? And once I was able to say that that's the question I'm addressing, it gave me the power to say to others, you might see a lot of things going on, but I have a singular focus on this planet.
I absolutely love that perspective and really appreciate you articulating that in that way. So jumping off from the point that you just made, that your main focus is how do all of us, photosynthetic or not, know who we are, where we are, and respond to our environment. And so I just wanted to share a piece of the book that I really found intriguing. Yes. Was when you talked about this sense of awareness or memory that may or may not exist in plants, and really transforming how we think about awareness, about memory, about intelligence. And this is me maybe pulling a little bit because I know of your work in mentoring and the fact that it truly is all connected. How we think about the autonomy of the things, the people that we care for as well. So I just really enjoyed that aspect of the book and really challenging the way that I think of all of my plant babies as well.
Yes. No, I think it's powerful when we can break ourselves out of the context that we're somehow fundamentally different from every other organism on the planet. And the ways in which we interact with other organisms, we stop ourselves from doing that with humans. So we have all these artificial divides about how we see ourselves. And I think we really have to break through that and embrace that we are but one organism on the planet if we're going to remain on the planet, because we'll be gone and they'll still be here fine without us.
Won't they though? Like, won't they though? One of the
They'll
things
have a plant party.
We'll just be happier. I'm just one of the things that I teach in, so I'm in another domain, but one of the things I teach in astrophysics is this point about like, you know, when and how different demises will happen to the Earth. So we study when the Milky Way and Andromeda will merge. That's, 6 billion years. We talk about when the sun will go red giant. That's 6 billion years. And so to your point, like just from astrophysically speaking, it is also true that like the world will go on, whether or not we're on it. Like, so Thanks to plants for keeping us aware of that point. And I also had a sort of point that like really hit me hard in the book, and it was in the chapter on risk to win. And when I tell you that when I read that there were plants do risk assessment and make dynamic environmental sensing decisions, I literally was like reading and I had to close the book and put it down. I was like, nah, she done gone too far out here with this. So can you just say a little bit more about that? It blows my mind.
No, it's fascinating because we don't think about plants taking risks, but they will take risk. And so, plants that are growing in a constant access of nutrients, they're like, I have everything I need. There's no need of taking a risk. But ones that are sensing dynamics, they're able to sense when there is something positive likely coming along, and I'm going to take a risk and expand my roots so that when it comes along, I can increase. And I think we don't often, well, I won't say we, some of us don't assess risk well enough. Being a Black woman in the white academy, I had to learn how to assess risk really early. And you can't just put your all out there for everyone in every situation. It's critical that we really do learn to assess our environment and take a risk sometimes, but not when it's not warranted. And I think plants have a lot to teach us about taking risks, competing, so many different things.
Yeah, I really loved the overall theme and like concept of this book. I was eagerly awaiting getting my copy. I was home, I remember, with my parents, and my dad was like, let me show you my orchids and tell you what I've learned from them. And I was like, boy, do I have a book for you as soon as I'm done reading it. Happy to share. So I would love it if you could let our audience know how they can get a hold of this book for the folks who are not my parents and will not be receiving my copy when I'm done.
Yeah, so I keep telling people, if you're in Little Rock, Arkansas, you will find my mother on a corner pushing out books. So if you're there, that's where you'll get your book. If you are not there and she's not forcing a book up on you, you can get it anywhere. But I have encouraged people to use like bookshop.org because it does support a local bookstore. And I'm a Black woman. If you are in a town with a Black bookstore, support a Black bookstore. But our local bookstores really need support all the time, but especially in the middle of this pandemic.
100%. Thank you so much. And so then now you said you wrote it because you wanted to be in conversation and dialogue with your family. And then you wanted to sort of work out all of the sort of ideas you had around this body of work. So then what's next for you?
So I have more books in me. I am working on another book. I'm not yet talking about what it is yet, but there have been many opportunities for me to write some things related to this. I wrote a piece for Elle magazine that I was able to feature my late father. So I've been taking some of those opportunities that make sense as I move deeply into the next project or two that will be forthcoming.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And you really, to Anicca's point, you really are prolific. And so I'm just waiting to read whatever the next thing is you're going to bless us with, because it's always a good time to read Dr. Beronda Montgomery's work.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for all of your support, but thank you just for supporting Black women writers. Vanguard STEM is always there to support the community. And I really appreciate you supporting Black women, Black non-binary writers who are out there trying to share what our gifts are.
It is our absolute pleasure. I've had a wonderful experience reading, even maybe being called out a little bit by some of the things that I've been reading in our VS Gets Lit book club. And then your book in particular is the first book that we've covered so far in the VS Gets Lit book club by someone else in the biosciences. So for me, that was a particular joy as I was reading, and I was like, "Ooh, Jedidah's told me something," because last month we covered Chanda Prescott Weinstein's book, and that was wonderful. But as I was reading about those quarks and whatnot, I was definitely like, I will just take your word for that one. But reading about plant phenotypes and cyanobacteria and photosynthesis definitely made me feel a little warm. I have to tell you,
if you haven't heard, me and Chanda are going to collide in a book event coming up in June, and we are so excited about that conversation together. So.
Oh, we will be in them streets. We will be in all of them streets. Listen, that's amazing. I did learn a lot. I definitely had to go back to the Latin and be like, do my, sounding out my syllables with my phonics on some of these words. I was like, let me just put those little, how the slashes in between the syllables.
You felt like you were studying for the SAT all over again.
didn't know this was the kind of lesson I was getting.
All the lessons, all of them.
No, it is amazing. Thank you so much for writing it. It's, again, Lessons from Plants, Dr. Beronda Montgomery. Please go out and get it. Support your local Black businesses by buying it at a local bookstore. You have one more chance to win that book by putting a question in the chat or by tweeting us your question. So without further ado, we would just like to thank you, Dr. Montgomery, for showing up and showing out and being such an incredible part of our community. Thank you for writing the book, and we will talk to you very, very soon.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. All right, fam. So it's time for us to wrap our story and give you a night free to yourself. Of course, after we finished our show, thank you for staying around for those that did. And what we'll do here is just remind you that like next month, we're going to be talking about our content for Asian American and Pacific Islander Month and hoping to complicate notions around that option. We'll be announcing our next book club. We'll be giving, again, the book away for free every Friday. Definitely keep following us on socials to find out more about that. You can subscribe to YouTube here, down there. You can follow us on Twitter, on Instagram. I don't know what I was saying there. I have no idea, but you know where you find us, at Vanguard STEM everywhere. Please stay safe during the pandemic. And thanks to the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for generous funding to help make this show possible. Anicca, as always, it's a pleasure, sis. Pleasure.
Wonderful to host these conversations with you. But I will say there was one final point that you forgot to mention. Which is you can find our paper everywhere on all of our social medias at Vanguard STEM. Our social media coordinator is definitely about to tweet out that link because I just heard her laugh about it. And we are the cover article. So please go read that paper and get your life right.
Get your life right. That's my words to end on. Read your paper, get your life